we are driven back, said an old Indian warrior, until we can retreat no farther. Our hatchets are broken, our bows are snapped, our fires are nearly extinguished. A little longer, and the white man will cease to persecute us, for we shall cease to exist.
The Hudson River is the only sea level breakthrough in the Appalachian chain on the eastern seaboard, which to us is nothing. You know, well, you get in the plane, fly over, you don't even see it when you're in the plane. But for centuries, people stood on this side of that barrier and sort of wondered what was on the other side, and they got little dribs and drabs reports. To them, it was a major barrier. The Hudson River is the only sea level avenue through that barrier, and that's why, with the help of the Erie Canal, the development of the West came right through the Hudson, and it came notably through the Hudson Highlands. I mean, that's the breakthrough. Right at West Point, Bear Mountain, that stretch in there, that's the breakthrough. That's not only beautiful, it's historically of incredible significance.
Well, you know, people who couldn't make out here would have to be pretty damn dumb, because you could just skim off the top of the earth and make a fortune. But look how much we've done to this continent, how much we've exploited it. If we had environmental impact statements in the post-Civil War period, I can just hear the howls that would have gone up on the part of some Americans had they said, well, we're going to go into the Great Plains of the Middle West and we're going to get rid of the 60 million buffalo, and we're going to open it up for farming, and we're going to spray it with chemicals. And, you know, people would have said you're out of... Some people would have said you're crazy. Others would have said, hey, man, let's go. But you just can't put that on Americans alone. You can go back to Genesis. You know, a man shall have dominion over the earth. I quarrel with that.
The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They hand in hand with wandering steps and slow through Eden took their solitary way. Paradise lost.
The whole power plant case broke open in 1963 when Consolidated Edison announced it was going to build a pump storage plant at Storm King Mountain. That is a plant that would suck water uphill, store it in a giant bathtub or reservoir, and then when power was generated, release it down through the same tunnel through which it had passed, only this time it would turn turbines to meet peak demand.
This 16-acre reservoir here would have been expanded to approximately 250 acres, and at full power pumping it would have contained 8 billion gallons of water, which would have been released daily, partially released, during peak period hours in the consumer service area.
It's really one of the magnificent scenes of the world, and it was this that aroused so many citizens to try to do something to stop what at that time seemed impossible, namely to prevent a utility that had always had its way in this state, as utilities had always had their way in this country, from building a power plant, the Storm King power plant on that hill.
Coupled with that, there was concern about the nuclear plants. There had been enormous fish kills at Indian Point 1. Again, we're back to fish. And these plants were located, as with the Storm King plant would have been, in the worst part of the estuary. It's like setting up a machine gun in a nursery ward. The fight went on for 17 years. It was finally resolved after 20 months of negotiations. Scenic Hudson had originally acted on Storm King, later joined on Storm King by the Fishermen's Association, but then the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, with the Natural Resources Defense Council as our attorneys, also intervened on the nuclear plant cases. And the reason the whole case came to a settlement was because we had defeated them with Indian Point by getting a ruling that cooling towers would be required there to protect the fish. So it was the leverage we had at Indian Point that enabled Con Ed to throw in the towel on Storm King.
And all the land that you can see off in this direction were Con Edison lands. Those lands have been now contributed to the state of New York's Palisades Interstate Park Commission, and they're protected forever as wildlands will remain in this state.
But on the other hand, we used all of this 17 years of battle and testimony to say to Con Edison, we want you and the other utilities to put up the money to endow an independent foundation. So the Hudson River Foundation for Science and Environmental Research is now in existence. So it's about $20 million right now. It was a kind of creative solution to healing the wounds, if you want, of the fight that had taken place in the past, but it was an advance for the river. It's a positive step. This is the only river in the world that I'm aware of that has its own private endowment.
It was a landmark decision, and it was prominent indeed in really unleashing the flood of environmental litigation that followed. Scenic Hudson was remarkable, the ability to hang in as long as it did, and that was, in the early phases, I think primarily due to Stephen Smokey Duggan, and from 1968 on, due almost single-handedly to Fran Reese, who just made it keep going and raise money in one way or another by hook or crook. So it was 17 years. That's an incredible amount of time to have been engaged in a case and to have won it.
Until we get the machinery and the laws and the criteria of what is good for the valley as a whole, we're going to have to keep fighting all these individual little fights, which aren't so little, I might add. Mediation probably would only work if there is a balance of power. With the Con Ed Storm King thing, the big thing was the cooling towers. The cooling towers were the weights in the scale it could balance, and Con Ed was only too glad, I think, to get... They came out with something. Everybody came out with something. But if you come up against a mediation problem where it looks as if all the spoils are going to one, then mediation is out. Storm King is still, to me, the sort of the symbol of a forever commitment to try to look at the river as a whole. With all the powers that man has to be destructive, it was also the symbol of all the powers that we all have to gather around and say, this isn't enough, this isn't what we want.
And it's amazing that, it's as though humanity is speeding along, and we're always about ready to do ourselves in. It's as though we were in a racing car going toward the edge of the cliff, but the edge of the cliff seems to keep moving. It's kind of a trick movie scene. I mean, the Hudson River almost went over. Well, we almost crashed with the river, but we didn't. And we just seemed to learn things in time enough to say, hey, let's change. But there's so much to learn.
The Hudson River Fishermen's Association asked me to be the Hudson River Keeper. And the River Keeper concept was really born in 1969 in Bob Boyle's book, The Hudson River. And Bob in 1969 envisioned the day when there would be a river keeper on the Hudson, based in part on the river keepers they have in England, where they take care of trout streams, salmon streams, usually for private clubs. Go ahead, Bear. So Bob, as president of the Fishermen's Association, was really the father of the idea here. So the Fishermen's Association used $25,000 that they had received in the settlement of the Con Ed case. And we decided we wanted to build a small patrol boat. One of the things that we're proudest of is that our 2 decades of work in the Fishermen's Association has usually been supported by the the spoils of our battles with polluters. And we would like to think that it's polluters and the spoilers of the Hudson who would continue to be our main source of support.
I remember starting a page dealing with the environment in the journal probably 20 years ago. And that was when it was described, remember, by one of the Kennedys as an open sewer. And there was big jokes as to when the Hudson would go up in flames. And so there was a big movement, and Rockefeller was in the forefront of it, to bring public money to bear on the problems of the river. And I can recall going down to his giant mansion in Westchester County and meeting with all the editors down there and trying to come up with a way to make sure that that issue was approved by the people. And there was such an enormous interest in it that it went before the voters and it was approved. And with that, all the municipalities, which were the worst polluters, and the corporations that were polluters, began to work on it.
In the end, environmental policies mirror the success of powerful political forces, whether they are newly formed groups or entrenched allies.
All tidal marshes are extraordinarily important. They produce anywhere from 10 to 20 times as much food, biomass, as the best farmland anywhere in the world. And they do it basically at no cost to us. About 80% of all the fin fish and shellfish in the North Atlantic depend upon tidal marshes, like Constitution Marsh, for some stage of their life cycle. They either spawn in these marshes, or in the case of striped bass and shad, which may spawn out in the open Hudson, the young larvae often move into these tidal marshes to spend the summer growing up. Other species spend the winter in these tidal marshes. And the point is, if we lost all of the tidal marshes along the North Atlantic coast, we'd lose about 80% of all the fish and shellfish in the North Atlantic. Constitution Marsh has a couple of distinctions. It appears to be, or at least Foundry Cove, which adjoins Constitution Marsh on the north, is the most heavily cadmium polluted place that anybody has found so far anywhere in the world. In 1952, the Army Signal Corps built a nickel cadmium battery factory in the village of Cold Spring to make batteries for Nike missiles to be used during the Korean conflict. And after the Korean War was over, the Army leased the battery factory to Sonotone and then later to Marathon. And for about 25 years, these companies produced nickel-cadmium batteries, dumping the waste from this operation, which was basically nickel, cadmium, and some cobalt, first into the Hudson River. For the first 6 years of operation, the waste went directly into the Cold Spring waterfront, into the Hudson River. And from then on, it went into Foundry Cove at the north end of the marsh through a pipe. And right now, we estimate something like 25 to 30 tons of cadmium in Foundry Cove, and possibly almost as much in the Hudson River. The sediments in some places in Foundry Cove are more than 30% elemental cadmium and nickel. Ore this rich doesn't exist anywhere in the world. But cadmium is a toxic heavy metal. It builds up in the central nervous system, the kidneys, the liver. It can cause a number of diseases and eventually death. The site is just too dangerous to let it sit.
This river is the last estuary on the east coast of the United States that still has reliable runs of striped bass, American shad, Atlantic sturgeon, just to name 3 species of fish. Not a single juvenile American shad has been found in the upper nursery grounds of Chesapeake Bay for 11 straight years. When Maryland closed shad fishing in 1980, the catch was down to 30,000 pounds. There's been no improvement. Striped bass in Maryland are on their last legs. Same is true in North Carolina. Up and down the coast, all these estuaries for various reasons. I suspect it's acid rain in the Chesapeake and in the Carolinas and in parts of Canada. These estuaries are being devastated. This is the last numbered Swiss bank account for the coastal environment. You don't sacrifice this.
Every spring, the shad fishermen return to set their nets twice a day at ebb tide, draping them along 1,200 feet of poles. When the tide comes in, these gill nets are lifted and emptied of their catch. Drift nets are also used with floats and weighted at the bottom. The silverbacks are running is the shout that spreads the word as thousands of iridescent shad migrate upriver. Females deposit eggs on the flats between Kingston and Coxsackie. The few young that survive and mature spend the summer in the upper reaches. At 3 to 5 inches of length, they swim downstream and into the ocean. 5 years later, weighing 2 to 5 pounds, they complete the cycle and return to spawn in the Hudson River, the place they first knew life.
Where the sad part comes in is that beginning in 1975 and 76, when consumption of fish was starting to go up, came the PCB revelations and the closing of a good part of the commercial fishery. Fishermen lost their eel fishery, they lost their striped bass fishery, they lost their catfish fishery.
I think that's in.
PCBs are industrial chemicals used in the manufacture of capacitors and transformers because of their fire-retarding abilities. By the time it was understood how dangerous PCBs are as they pass up the food chain through plankton, fish, birds, and mammals, more than 500,000 pounds had been dumped into the Hudson River from General Electric's plant in Fort Edward. GE made a $4 million settlement with New York State, the EPA, and environmentalists. But a decade later, the issue of the river's PCB contamination, perhaps the single most pressing environmental concern, has not been resolved. Removal of the most concentrated sediments to an encapsulated landfill raises fears that dredging will further disperse PCBs downriver. Meanwhile, the river system has not been able to naturally rid itself of the chemically stable PCBs, which cling to organic matter and accumulate in the body fat of living organisms. The striped bass commercial fishery has been lost, and in the upper Hudson, recreational fishing is closed.
Well, I have 5 and 6 gals working on my crew. They're a little neater than the guys. Some have been with me for 15 years, and they work with the live transplant programs with the Pennsylvania Fish Commission. One nice thing about this net, the fish that you don't want, you can just release them. It doesn't hurt them. Ah, little fat little guy. We are trying to restock the Susquehanna River with shad. Shad population in a lot of the rivers has died off down towards Virginia and in the Chesapeake, mostly due to pollution, I would say, more so than overfishing. But thank God the Hudson has maintained a good, healthy population. And so actually we're sharing some of ours with Pennsylvania, and there's a possibility we might be sharing more with different states, you know, if they need them.
You want to turn them? Okay, 245.
245 pounds.
The dissection today is Well, the various organs will be analyzed for PCB content. We have very little information on Atlantic sturgeon in the Hudson River because we just don't get the opportunity. We test the striped bass every year. We're dealing with 2 parts per million as the Food and Drug Administration tolerance level. They are definitely over 2 parts per million on striped bass, and the commercial fishery is closed. And right now the recreational fishery has severe restrictions. This fish that we're cutting up, the roe out of that would be worth about $2,000, whereas the fish that was cut up earlier this morning had roughly 24 pounds, and that would have been worth approximately $1,000. So that commercial fisherman, just in that one instance, lost $3,000 worth of revenue.
If all the fish in the river were free of PCBs, then we could make a real good living. We'd be fishing for carp, catfish and bullheads, and eels. There's a tremendous market for eels in Europe, and we have tons and tons of eels in the river.
For me personally, I didn't learn to love the river until I was able to have the opportunity to say, damn this river. You know, I mean, there's nothing is worth, you know, wind's blowing wrong, the tide's going wrong. I just hate this damn river. When I was able to have that experience, and working with a commercial fisherman, you get to have that experience several times over. I had a different picture of the river. Not just that it was a living thing, but, you know, in the most profound way, it doesn't really care what we do. I mean, there's no... And that leads you to the understanding that there's also no consciousness there. And you try and figure out where the river begins and ends and how you fit into that scheme. And there is no beginning and ending.
$50,000 or $60,000 Algonquian Indians and Iroquoian Indians were living in the Hudson watershed when Henry Hudson sailed up this river 375 years ago. And they left some evidence behind. They left shell mounds, you know, the odd spear point and stone scraper and hammerstone here and there. There was no long-lasting consequence of their having been here for at least 6,000 years that we know of. We've been here for 375 years, and we have left marks that will take tens of thousands and perhaps hundreds of thousands of years to erase. We consume more, we use more, we change things chemically. We live a high-tech life. I can't imagine that we can continue making VCRs, foreign vacations, and closets full of coordinated clothes our top priorities and expect to see environmental improvement as a coincidental byproduct.
People think of environmentalism as a fairly recent concern in this aspect of environment versus commerce and development. But in fact, these concerns have been expressed for about 150 years. And we have records showing that when the railroad was constructed, the railroad came through the Hudson Valley around 1848. When the railroad was constructed, a lot of very prominent people, including Washington Irving, were very upset about the fact that it was going to destroy people's access to the river. It was going to destroy the peace and quiet of the river. And there was a movement afoot to try to derail the railroad. And was unsuccessful. The railroad lobby was very powerful, and they were able to win the right to construct the railroad right along the river's edge.